Gold has always been treated as certainty. For centuries, it was something you could hold, hide, trade, or pass down. It required no permission. Its value did not depend on governments, borders, or trust in institutions. And then, in the United States, gold became illegal. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real treasure, economic decisions, and the long-term consequences of history, consider liking the video and subscribing. It quietly supports the continuation of stories like this. In 1933, Americans were ordered to surrender their gold to the federal government. Coins, bars, and certificates accumulated over lifetimes were no longer treated as personal property. They were reclassified as a national problem. According to historical records, this decision did not follow a war, a revolution, or a foreign invasion. It emerged from an economic emergency, one that challenged the idea that gold could remain neutral in times of crisis. For the first time in American history, owning gold was not just discouraged, it was illegal. The metal itself did not change. Its weight remained the same. Its scarcity remained real. What changed was the system around it. This is the story of gold that could no longer be used, not because it disappeared, but because possession itself became a liability. To understand why gold was restricted, it is necessary to understand how deeply it was embedded in the American economy. In the early 20th century, the United States operated under the gold standard. Currency was not just backed by trust or authority. It was tied directly to physical reserves. Every dollar represented a claim. According to contemporary accounts, this system worked as long as confidence held. But when the Great Depression struck, confidence evaporated faster than gold could circulate. Banks failed. Withdrawals surged. People hoarded gold rather than spending currency. The metal meant to stabilize the system was being removed from it. Gold stopped moving. Later historical analysis indicates that this hoarding effect amplified deflation. Prices fell. Credit contracted. Economic activity slowed further. Gold, once considered a safeguard, became an obstacle. As more people withdrew gold from circulation, the government's ability to manage the economy weakened. Monetary policy was constrained by physical reserves that individuals controlled. The problem was not greed. It was rational behavior. People trusted gold more than banks, and in doing so, they unintentionally deepened the crisis. By 1933, the US government faced a dilemma: either abandon gold's central role or take control of it. The turning point came not gradually, but suddenly. On April 5, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. Its language was formal, legal, and restrained. Its effect was unprecedented. According to historical records, the order required all Americans to surrender most forms of gold they owned to the Federal Reserve by May 1 of that year. This included gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates. The government did not frame the order as confiscation. It was presented as a temporary emergency measure necessary to stabilize the economy and protect the public interest. But the scope was absolute. Private ownership of monetary gold was no longer a right. It became a violation. The penalties were explicit. Failure to comply could result in a fine of up to $10,000, a staggering sum at the time, or up to 10 years in prison. In some interpretations, both. Gold was no longer neutral. It was now regulated. What made the order especially striking was how ordinary gold ownership had been. Coins were kept in drawers, safes, and small boxes. Gold certificates circulated like cash. For many families, gold was not an investment, it was savings. Contemporary accounts suggest that the announcement created confusion rather than immediate resistance. Many Americans struggled to understand how something legal for generations could suddenly become forbidden. There was no spectacle, no soldiers at doors, no mass seizures. Compliance relied on voluntary surrender backed by threat. People were instructed to bring their gold to banks. In return, they received paper currency at a fixed rate, $20.67 per ounce. The exchange was mandatory. The price was not negotiable. Later historical analysis emphasizes how carefully the order was structured. Jewelry and certain collector coins were exempt. Small personal allowances were permitted. The goal was not to eliminate gold entirely from society, but to remove it from circulation as money. Still, the psychological impact was profound. Gold had crossed a line. It was no longer something individuals controlled. It now belonged to policy. Reactions to the gold ban varied, not by ideology, but by circumstance. According to contemporary accounts, many Americans complied quickly. The threat of punishment was clear, and trust in government action remained relatively strong in the early New Deal years. For people who had already lost jobs, savings, or homes, gold surrender felt like another sacrifice in a long series of losses. Compliance was framed as contribution, a civic duty in a national emergency. But others hesitated. Some delayed, some concealed, some quietly refused. Later historical analysis indicates that enforcement was uneven. The federal government did not conduct widespread searches. Prosecutions were rare. The system relied more on deterrence than force. This ambiguity created space for personal judgment. Some Americans turned in their gold immediately, believing the order would be temporary. Others suspected, correctly, that something more permanent was underway. Within months of collecting gold at the fixed price, the government raised its official value to $35 per ounce. This effectively devalued the dollar and increased the government's gold reserves overnight. Those who had surrendered their gold saw the implications clearly. They had not only lost possession, they had lost upside. The metal they turned in was now worth significantly more, but only to the state. This moment hardened skepticism. Gold ceased to feel like a shared stabilizer. It began to feel like a controlled asset, one whose value could be redefined after surrender. Stories circulated quietly. Neighbors whispered. Trust recalibrated. Some families hid coins rather than turn them in. Others converted gold into jewelry to stay within exemptions. A few buried it, convinced the ban would one day be lifted. Gold moved underground, literally and psychologically. Even among those who complied, the meaning of ownership shifted. Paper currency became something issued by authority, not anchored to something you could retrieve. The relationship between citizens and value had changed, and it would remain changed for decades. When gold ownership became illegal, the question of benefit was unavoidable. Someone always benefits when control shifts. According to historical records, the most immediate beneficiary of the gold ban was the federal government itself. By forcing gold out of private hands and into central reserves, the state regained control over the monetary base at a moment when flexibility was urgently needed. Gold that had been dispersed across millions of individuals was consolidated into a single authority. This consolidation mattered. Under the gold standard, monetary policy was constrained by the amount of gold in circulation. Interest rates, credit availability, and currency issuance were tied to physical reserves that a government could not easily expand. Once private ownership was restricted, those constraints loosened. Later historical analysis shows that the government's ability to raise the official price of gold after consolidation was not an accident. It was the point. By increasing gold's official value from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, the state effectively devalued the dollar and expanded its balance sheet without printing new currency in the traditional sense. This move injected liquidity into the economy. Banks stabilized. Credit began to flow. Prices stopped falling as rapidly. The gold ban, combined with other New Deal measures, helped arrest the deflationary spiral that had defined the early years of the Great Depression. From a systemic perspective, the policy worked, but benefits were not evenly distributed. The government gained optionality, the ability to act without negotiating with millions of private holders. Financial institutions benefited from a more predictable monetary environment. Exporters gained from a weaker dollar. Individuals, however, lost leverage. They no longer held an asset that existed outside the system. Gold ceased to be a personal safeguard against institutional failure and became a tool managed by those institutions. Contemporary accounts reflect this shift subtly. Gold disappeared from everyday conversation. It was no longer something you discussed openly, displayed, or planned around. Its role moved upward into vaults, ledgers, and policy rooms. The ban did not erase gold's importance. It centralized it, and centralization always changes who benefits first. Once gold was removed from private circulation, its meaning transformed. Before the ban, gold had been money. It circulated, accumulated, and moved alongside daily economic life. Afterward, it became something else entirely. According to later historical analysis, gold's new role was symbolic as much as functional. It no longer needed to circulate to anchor trust. Its presence in Federal Reserve served as a signal, a quiet assertion of backing without direct access. Gold became invisible. Americans could no longer touch it, trade it, or save it directly. Over time, entire generations grew up without first-hand experience of gold as money. Currency became abstract, a promise backed by authority rather than metal. This abstraction reshaped financial behavior. Savings moved into banks, bonds, and later equities. Trust migrated from object to systems. The idea of personal financial sovereignty weakened, replaced by participation in institutional frameworks. Gold remained, but at a distance. It sat in vaults like Fort Knox, referenced in reports, but absent from daily life. Its weight still mattered, but only to those managing policy, not those living under it. Contemporary observers noted that gold's silence was part of its power. By removing it from circulation, the government reduced panic-driven hoarding. Gold could no longer be withdrawn during crises because it was no longer available. Stability improved, but so did dependency. Without gold as an exit option, individuals had fewer ways to opt out of monetary policy decisions. Economic participation became more collective, less discretionary. Gold had become a reserve, not a choice. This transformation endured. Even after private ownership was eventually legalized again decades later, gold never fully returned to its previous role. Its psychological position had shifted permanently. It was no longer something you kept just in case. It was something the system kept, on your behalf. And that distinction defined an era. After gold was removed from private hands, something unexpected happened. It stopped being discussed. There were no ongoing debates, no recurring public arguments, no visible resistance movement centered on gold ownership. According to contemporary accounts, the subject faded from everyday conversation with surprising speed. This silence was not accidental. Gold had been refrained from a personal concern into a technical matter. It was no longer something individuals needed to think about. Decisions about gold were now embedded in policy, handled by experts, and discussed in institutional language that discouraged public engagement. Gold became administrative. Later historical analysis suggests that this shift was one of the most effective aspects of the ban. By removing gold from daily life rather than attacking it publicly, the government reduced its symbolic power. What people cannot access, they stop imagining. Generations grew up without handling gold coins, without saving in metal, without associating financial security with something physical. Currency became paper, then numbers, then accounts. The absence of gold normalized abstraction. During this period, economic crises still occurred, but the response mechanisms had changed. There was no mass hoarding of gold, because hoarding was no longer possible. Panic had fewer physical outlets. Gold's silence contributed to stability, but it also contributed to detachment. Without gold as a reference point, discussions about value became more theoretical. Inflation, debt, and monetary expansion were debated in percentages and policy terms rather than in ounces and weight. Trust shifted upward. People trusted institutions not because they could verify reserves themselves, but because the system functioned without visible alternatives. Gold's absence made compliance easier. There was nothing to compare against. The silence endured for decades. By the time gold ownership was legalized again in the 1970s, the cultural memory of gold as everyday money had largely disappeared. The ban had not only changed policy, it had altered perception. Gold had not been defeated. It had been forgotten. The gold ban did more than restrict ownership. It redefined what Americans considered valuable. Before 1933, value was often associated with tangibility. Gold could be held, hidden, and transported. Its worth was inherent, independent of issue or promise. After the ban, value became relational. Money derived meaning from systems rather than substance. Its reliability depended on institutions, regulations, and collective trust. This was not a sudden transition, but a gradual recalibration reinforced by decades without gold in circulation. Later historical analysis indicates that this shift influenced behavior far beyond currency. Risk tolerance increased. Leverage expanded. Long-term debt became normalized. Without a universally trusted physical anchor, economic confidence relied more heavily on growth expectations and policy credibility. Markets became forward-looking rather than preservation-focused. This did not make the system weaker. It made it different. Americans became more comfortable with abstraction. Financial literacy shifted toward instruments rather than assets. Stocks, bonds, and credit products gained prominence as stores of value. Gold, when it returned as a legal asset, returned as an investment, not as money. It was bought, traded, and speculated on, but rarely trusted as a foundation. Its role had been reframed. It was now one option among many, not the standard beneath them. The ban had done its work. It had separated value from physical certainty and attached it to institutional continuity. This allowed for greater flexibility, faster response to crises, and broader economic participation. But it also introduced a new vulnerability. When trust falters, there is no metal to retreat to. There is only confidence, or the absence of it. Gold's removal did not eliminate fear. It redirected it, and that redirection would shape every major economic decision that followed. Gold returned quietly. There was no national announcement framed as a correction. No admission that a 40-year restriction had reshaped financial life. According to historical records, the prohibition on private gold ownership in the United States formally ended on December 31, 1974. On January 1, 1975, Americans could legally own gold again. The return was procedural, not symbolic. By that time, the economic landscape had changed completely. The gold standard had already been dismantled. The dollar no longer represented a fixed claim on metal. Currency floated on trust, policy, and global confidence rather than ounces stored in vaults. Gold returned to a system that no longer needed it. Later historical analysis suggests that this timing was critical. If gold ownership had been restored earlier, While it still functioned as a monetary anchor, its role might have reasserted itself. Instead, it re-entered an economy that had learned to operate without it. Gold was legal, but unnecessary. Financial institutions adapted quickly. Gold was reintroduced as a commodity, an investment vehicle, and eventually a speculative asset. Futures markets expanded. Prices fluctuated freely. Gold became something you traded, not something you relied on. Contemporary accounts from the mid-1970s describe public curiosity rather than urgency. Americans did not rush to reclaim gold as savings. They experimented with it cautiously, often through intermediaries rather than physical possession. The meaning of gold had shifted. It was no longer a foundation. It was an option. The decades of absence had broken continuity. There was no inherited habit of holding gold, no collective memory of using it as protection. Gold ownership returned without its former authority. It had been legalized, but culturally displaced. When gold ownership returned, something important did not. Certainty did not come back. Before the ban, gold represented an exit, a way to step outside the system if trust collapsed. After the ban, and even after legalization, that function never fully recovered. According to later historical analysis, the decades without gold had normalized dependence on institutional stability. People learned to navigate risk through diversification, insurance, and regulation rather than withdrawal. Gold could no longer serve as a universal refuge because the system no longer recognized it as such. Even those who purchased gold after 1975 often did so as a hedge, not a guarantee. It existed alongside stocks, bonds, and real estate, not beneath them. The psychological hierarchy had changed. Gold no longer sat at the bottom of value, anchoring everything else. It floated within the same risk space as other assets. Its authority had been flattened. This shift mattered during later crises. During inflationary periods, market crashes, and financial shocks, gold prices moved, sometimes sharply, but the response was transactional, not existential. People bought and sold. They did not retreat into gold. The option to opt out had become theoretical. The system that replaced gold-based certainty offered flexibility, speed, and scale. But it also required continuous trust. There was no longer a physical backstop that individuals could personally verify. Gold's return revealed the permanence of its removal. It could be owned again, but it could not be what it once was. And that is the quiet outcome of the ban. Not confiscation, not control, but transformation. The story of gold becoming illegal in America is often described as a policy decision, but its deeper impact was cultural. Gold did not disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the system no longer wanted individuals to have an exit. According to historical records, the ban was introduced as an emergency measure, temporary, practical, and justified by circumstance. Yet its effects extended far beyond the crisis that created it. For over 40 years, Americans lived without legal access to gold as money. During that time, an entire economic identity shifted. Value became abstract. Trust became centralized. Stability was managed rather than held. When gold returned, it returned to a world that had already moved on. It could be owned, traded, and speculated on, but it could not reclaim its former role as certainty. The habit of relying on something outside the system had been broken. Gold transformation was quiet, but permanent. The metal remained the same. Its weight did not change. Its scarcity endured. What changed was its meaning. Gold no longer represented independence. It represented participation. The ban did not eliminate gold. It redefined what ownership itself meant. And that raises a final question. If an object can retain its value, but lose its role. If something once considered essential can become optional, what does that say about the nature of security? And who's allowed to hold it?